So last week we got to the place where we were talking about some of the positive aspects of the kingdom in terms of bringing it to pass and some of the ways that that happens and some of our hopes for that as it unfolds in the possibilities of the Spirit at work in us, and where we then, as the church, the Big C followers of Jesus, all united, then operate as leaders in the world. And the whole idea of a leadership that we looked at was just the lens of influence, that leaders influence, and so using that as just a very simple way to get into that idea, we began to tease out the idea of our role as leaders in the world and how that might bring the kingdom more into focus as we begin to think through how to do that in the different arenas of life that are available in the world. And we talked a little bit about leadership being formal and informal. I mean, you can have a formal role of leadership in a society, but there's lots of informal ways to lead as well. Particularly if influence is our value that we're going for. You can be a leader and not be in any official position. But one of the things that we talked about were the traits of that I want to review just quickly to then position us for where we want to go today on that. But leadership then, the kind of leaders that are helpful in bringing this about are people who recognize and identify reality for what it is. So part of the leader's task is to help simply reveal or convey or define the reality that exists. And that's one of the most helpful roles that a leader provides, is to say, well, this is what we're dealing with. Then from that point, the leader can offer a compelling vision for an alternative to that reality, to say, well, this is the way it is, but it could be like this, or this is where we can go from here, and that's what you really want in that kind of leadership. So then the leader identifies and suggests ways for that alternative to be realized. It's not just enough to say, well, we should go in a different direction, and then not provide any, so good luck with that. God bless you guys. That's what happens when you read a commentary on a very difficult passage, and you're wanting some information, and you read in the text, and the commentary says, God bless us to your understanding, which means I don't know what this means either. So we're just going to move on from there. That's not really true leadership, but the leader is trying to provide a compelling vision for an alternative to the reality that they find themselves in. And so they suggest ways for that alternative to be realized. And then, helpfully, a leader can marshal resources to bring about change. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the leader provides the resources themselves, but a leader helps to identify the resources that are in place or available in a community or an area in order to bring about the change. One of the organizations that I worked for a long time ago, the last century, it was an organization that worked with developing neighborhoods in Mexico City. Mexico City, if you've been there, is a sprawling metropolitan area, and unlike other sprawling metropolitan areas, Mexico City often discourages neighborhoods from becoming part of Mexico City because they don't want to be responsible for a growing population. And so they discourage neighborhoods from incorporating into it, but they just can't help it. People are just growing. So this organization, which I led at that time, would work with existing communities and help to identify within the communities the people who could act in ways that would bring about the types of resources and help and direction that they were seeking to establish themselves as a community within the larger metropolitan area. Because oftentimes those communities come together and they just wait for the city then to do something, and the city would just ignore them, and so they had to find within themselves those resources. So it wasn't like, okay, we're from the United States, we're going to underwrite your existence here. Wasn't that. Our role is to help you see what you already have here, and to help develop that within your community, to encourage you in that, and to provide any assistance we can with this aspect of it. And it seemed to work. And then as communities would find within themselves those resources, they had new respect for one another in those communities, because they saw how beneficial it was for them to do that. And they felt good about themselves. It wasn't like we're dependent on an outside, resource that could go away at any time. It was within themselves to accomplish that. So a leader kind of marshals those resources to bring about the change, but helps to find them within what's already there. And then encourages progress as the vision is adopted to bring about change. I mean, that's what you want in leadership. Not, you're doing this all wrong. It's what is right about what we're doing, and what progress are we making in this regard, and to encourage that change. So, in essence, what we're asking, what I think the kingdom is asking us to do, is to be change agents in the world, to be people through whom change can come, knowing that ultimately that change comes through God, but we become the means by which that change is effected in the world. And so we're intentional in our pursuit, but we're gentle in our manner, because we have time, and we have a resource, that is limitless, and so we're not worried about running out of energy or resources or people or time or whatever. We can be gentle in the manner that we pursue, because the manner in which we approach this is going to be half the battle in bringing about the change that we're hoping for. I was reading an interesting article in the New York Times the other day. One of the opinion columnists, whose name I cannot pronounce, but his first name is Ross. So if you know how to pronounce the second name, which is Douthat, I have no idea how to pronounce that. But he writes on religious issues usually once a week. He writes about other things too, but he often writes about religious issues, and he's Catholic, and firmly Catholic and devout. But one of his columns this past week was on the how religion began, the need for religion and how that got started and so forth. And so I always kind of cringe when people who are not theologically informed or founded try to begin to explain theological issues. Not that people have to have a strong foundation, but there are some elementary issues that sometimes get overlooked in the process. And I don't mean this in an unkind way. I just sometimes cringe when that happens. Kind of like probably when physicians read medical advice on the web, and like, okay, you can try that, but these are my office hours when that doesn't work. So I began to read this article, and his column was not bad. It was actually, he did a fine job with the idea. And what he was talking about was the fact that humanity came to understand these inexplicable events and aspects of creation, and so religion kind of grew up to fill in the void of that understanding, to say, this is beyond our particular tangible experience, but we have an imagination into what might be the cause of all of this. And he then went into a different direction, as he said. A modern example of this could be, people's fascination with extraterrestrial beings, and that the imagination is trying to figure out what is going on with these phenomena and these episodes that are inexplicable at some sense, and so forth. And he said, so this is what was happening happening with religion. And so with these articles, I'm always interested to read the feedback. And I kind of anticipated just a boatload of negativity on that. Interestingly, it wasn't. There was maybe one or two letters of the. I mean, I don't read them all. There's 2,500 replies, and I got other things to do. But I usually do read a good number of them just to get a feel for it. But a couple of them went in a predictable route. But many of them were interesting to me because the tone of what they said was this religious kind of understanding would have a whole lot more credibility with me if the proponents actually lived by what they propose. And I was stunned by that because these people were not being mean. They were just being real. They were saying, I'm happy to have this if I can only believe that it would work, that it's true. Because they weren't seeing the evidence for what this was suggesting in the lives that at least they were encountering and that they had experience with and so forth. And I thought, well, this is the essence of what we're talking about here, is putting into place that process and that approach that wants to put tangible experience to what God has promised and given in Jesus Christ in the life that we have. It's got to be tangible in order to be real. That's what we're saying. That's what these readers were responding to say, it's just not tangible. We just don't see the evidence for it. And I wanted to say, well, then widen your experience. There's got to be more. Because usually there's one or two instances in their lives or one or two people in their lives that have kind of ruined it for them. And so instead of just assuming, well, that was just, an outlier or an anomaly, they just assume, well, that's true of everybody in that situation. And that's not right either. But this is what leadership tends to do, is to say, okay, let's not make the few to be representative of the whole. But this is what we're trying to do. We be gentle in the manner we persuade rather than prod people, and we talk more about using the idea of what if. What if? Instead of saying this is. See, the leadership is oftentimes misunderstood particularly in churches, and I have a lot of experience around this. When I say that when you come into a church, one of the first questions people will ask you is, "Well, what is your plan? What is your plan for what we're going to do?" And my response has often been, "I don't have a plan for what we're going to do. That's not up to me. It's not my church. I'm here as a steward of what God has brought together in this place. And so together we're going to discern what God is doing among us and try and follow God into that, whatever that is. But I can't tell you what that is." But in the contemporary church scene, and I've been to plenty of conferences where the big paid speaker, who you would all recognize, at various times, will say, "This is the way you do it." And it would outline, the plan for here's how you do this. Here's your 5-year plan. Here's your 10-year. I'm not even kidding. This is your 5-year plan. This is your 10-year plan. And this is your 15-year plan. And if you're not doing it like this, you're doing it wrong, And so even in the church, people get used to the idea of a leader telling you what to do and how to do it. And what we have to back away from is this authoritarian approach to what does it mean to live in the kingdom, and develop a more inquisitive, enchanted approach. And I use the word enchantment in a academic way, the sense of living in a larger spiritual reality than just the tangible kind of things, but to come back to the idea of saying, let's live with what if. What if we did it this way? What if this were the value that we lived by? How would that make a difference in what happens? And too often we don't come up with the what if, we come up with a this then. If you do this, then this will happen. and we don't give room for the Holy Spirit to lead our understanding. And this is the big difference, I think, between what happened in the book of Acts among the Christ followers who were open to the Holy Spirit and those who were still kind of, being dragged into the kingdom kicking and screaming. The people who were like, okay, yes, we're Christians, but we're still like we have to do these things. We have to do it according to the law. We have to do this, that, and the other, and so do you, and all of that. And people were saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't seem to be what the Spirit is doing right now. There seems to be something different going on. And that has been the perennial struggle of leadership within the kingdom of God is finding an era when something worked and then making that the norm for everything. and it can't be that way because nothing stays that static. It's all changing all the time. And so we have to be flexible to change with that and to recognize the Spirit bringing about that change. So we discovered, yes?
This is me, I don't know if it's a can of worms.
That's all right. If you're going to open it up, the choir's going to leave in 4 minutes anyway, so they're not going to help us solve this.
Historically, the church has had breakoffs.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of thinking of you do it my way or the highway part of that because it's a natural tendency of our human?
What do you think?
Yes.
Yes.
The doctors say yes.
Yes.
But we'll be gone in 3 minutes.
And yet, right doctrine is important. And
But who decides the
so-
right doctrine?
well, that's a giant question. And I'm saying to say that everything is relative, which is not what you're saying, but
Right.
that would be a way for everybody to get along with saying everybody's got their own truth and let's try to follow God without
Yeah.
trying to articulate some foundational beliefs. And I'll just throw it out there. It's been a little while since I have said it, but there's this common phrase that ideally, in essential issues, we'll have unity. In non-essentials, there's liberty for everybody to understand it the way they do, and in all things, charity or love. So that's kind of a way to talk about how can we do it. But it probably does lead to some of these divisions when people, are debating communion or many other things. So.
Yeah.
Man is taking on, we know, and they don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think it's very true that sincere Christians can definitely disagree on issues and say,
Sure.
okay, well, we disagree.
I disagree with that.
Jesus is like, and you kind of go different ways. I mean, that's, Paul and Silas and other, there's some examples of that in the church even.
I think it's respecting each other.
Mm-hmm.
That choice of, we think differently, we feel differently, but we can respect, if someone has a different opinion.
Yeah.
And I don't see that in politics right now.
Well, I don't see it in a lot of the church either. So
And it's caused a lot of division.
it caused a lot of division.
Ron has a comment.
The variety that's out there also, there are people that feel this way and people that feel this way. So if we have an approach where God, it's truth, and those can all be true without saying that's my truth, but if I don't feel the Spirit or whatever, then it's not gonna work. So, many of these break-off things are one size doesn't fit all.
Well, I think one of the interesting comments that Jesus made about this is he said, wisdom is proved right by her children. So obviously we can see in the long run whether or not this is a good thing to do. And a lot of times we don't give these things enough time, to kind of work themselves out.
Well, and a lot of times, I don't think the situation is actually the church saying my way or the highway. It's the individual. It's, I think a lot of the breakups in the past have been because people decided they didn't want to follow the tenets of this church and decide to move on. I think that's huge, is people shopping for their denomination or
Yeah, and I think if you go back into history, you find, what Daniel said is true, because there are major figures that had particular positions and so forth, who had a group of followers around them, and it was like, okay, well, this is what constitutes the true church, and so forth. And the other group are there, no, this is what constitutes the true church, kind of thing. And so there's, and unfortunately, we know the history between that. There was actually wars over that kind of stuff between two different factions, and that's never good. So it comes back to, well, how did that impact the church's witness in that time? And I think it was detrimental, to say the least. So, but it still is that way. I mean, I remember having a discussion with a fella, a professor, who said, "I can tell you what part of the country you came to Christ in." And he said, how can you do that? He says, the number of things that you consider to be essential. So, yes, Ping.
It makes me think about when you were talking about worldview and how, your worldview shapes how you look at religion and how you allow it to play out in your life. But our worldview needs to be secondary to what comes from the Bible, because that's God's worldview. And unfortunately, that's why you're here. The Bible's not easy to understand. So, like you were talking about the person at the beginning who said, "I don't get it, good luck,"
Yeah.
But then going back to agreeing to disagree. This is really difficult to understand. Here's what I think I understand. Well, here's what I think I understand. Okay, but we can still agree on the Trinity, that we need to be Spirit-led, the essentials, and keep referring back to the Bible instead of our own worldview. This is what makes sense to me, or this is what I like, or this is what I don't like, or I don't feel comfortable with this, even though we're not necessarily meant to feel comfortable.
Yeah, and I think the Bible gives us a good way to know, to become familiar with the mind of God. And to recognize that God has been at work in all of human history, and the Bible is the written record of that in this particular period of time. And there are some aspects of it that are universal and are repeated and show up all the time. There are other things that are, just locked into a particular period of time or a particular culture, and knowing the difference between those two is important. And we often disagree over that, something like that. We talked about that in a previous class. What's the difference between norms and normal? Well, norms are the things that are true for all people at all times. In a sense, when you're talking about biblical, normal is just this is what's going on in our neck of the woods, so to speak. And sometimes we've taken what is clearly something that was normal in the time of writing and made that a norm, for everybody. And sometimes that's the real conflict is between people who feel like, well, that should be a norm for everybody at all times. Kind of like the Amish people, in a sense, who still speak German. But it's a very old type of German. My dad, who was German, grew up in Germany and all of that. When he went to go speak with the Amish, he says, the closest thing I can tell you, it's a little bit like trying to listen to King James English. They speak a very old form of German, and even he had trouble, with it. So hanging on to some of the old, some of these things that have formed us, sometimes creates conflict in the larger thing when somebody else doesn't hold on to those same things. And so, yeah, I think there has to be some respect, and what you said is true, but what constitutes the essentials, that's what we need.
Everybody debates what's essential.
Kind of, there are some debates about what's essential. But But, I want to come back to what Jesus said about wisdom being proved right by our children, to say, okay, we could get to the point of just simply saying, okay, I respect, you as an individual and your particular direction and what you are convicted by, and I trust that that's mutual. Let's just both live out the kingdom as well as we can, given our mutual understanding or our understandings of how that works. People have said that, particularly missionaries, when you're out on the mission field, all the denominational differences tend to disappear, because they're just out there by themselves, and when they find other people who know the Lord and love the Lord, whether they're Presbyterian or Methodist or congregation or whatever it is, doesn't matter. They're just all on the same side, so to speak. They're all followers of Jesus. And I think that would be very healthy for all of us. I mean, there are preferences in the way we like to gather, the way we like to govern, and things like that. None of that is essential. Now, just because we like to gather in a particular way and we have particular governmental things that guide the way we do church doesn't mean that's the only way to do church. And we can respect other people who have different ideas about that and say, okay, fine, that works for you. Praise God, there's a number of different ways because we're not all the same, We're not all the same. And what appeals to us isn't going to appeal to some other people, right? Yes, Vicki?
I went on a mission trip, this was the second time, and I was going to the Grove Church, and we went to Honduras, and I was so nervous because I saw the ladies that were gonna go on it, and when you're on a mission, people can start complaining, why are they doing it that way, and what's up, and I could see, oh no, are they gonna be flexible? And you know what the Lord told me? Look for the treasure in each person. Look for that jewel, that specialness. And it totally changed me in how I relate to people.
Yeah, that's a good way of doing that. Okay, so we talk about the location of the kingdom in the world, right? That it's bigger than the church. The church is part of the kingdom, but it's not the whole of it. And the kingdom is really located in the world. That's where all of this takes place. And so we said the church is capable of exercising leadership in all areas of society. And so here's some areas of society that really are true. They're broadly identified under these areas, and there's a lot of subcategories under this as well. So. But we don't have a big enough whiteboard to do all the subcategories. But we can begin to plot those out and understand those. But it's helpful and it's possible, the contention is, for Christians to lead with kingdom values and for kingdom purposes in each of these areas. And to do so in all the ways we've been describing, as change agents and gentle and intentional and persuasive and so forth, and thinking through. It's not going to be easy, or quick. Remember, we talked about this is a long process. And but getting ourselves to places of influence or leadership in these areas will, once we're in those particular areas, we can make a difference in how these things are conducted. Because, the Bible does say some things about some of this. Not all of it, though. I don't think the Bible has much to say about the acting profession, for instance. But there are ways, to live out a particular value for the kingdom in that profession or in that field. So we have to think through, as people with the mind of Christ, how do we live in a place that will allow these things to coalesce for the benefit of all. One of the things you think about as you look through these different aspects, what's one value that seems to prevail for all of them? What could be true of all of them?
Love God and love people.
Okay, yeah, that's true. But in terms of just something they all hold in common, even if you're not a religious person or a Christ follower,
Service to others.
yes, okay? They're for the benefit of the whole, okay? They're for the benefit of the whole. These things exist so that people can get along and flourish, right? And so it's not like God says you have to have a university system, you know, that's set up this particular way or so forth. God doesn't say that in the Bible, but we do have these things that help us to create ways to get along. All of these are developed for the benefit of the whole and for the welfare and flourishing of the whole. But a lot of that has been lost by these particular areas because other values have overwhelmed that. It's not like they're in service to the common good. You know, what we normally think about is that these serve the common good. But you know, what is the common good? We've lost a lot of that as a culture because one aspect of our culture has basically overwhelmed most of it. Materialism has overwhelmed most of what we usually identify as service for the common good. You know, I mean, education is harder to put in that category. But government, you know, government is often seen now as a way to what? Control power, you know, have power, control other people, you know, advance my cause, my purpose. You know, business is often what? To make money, you know, to make money as much as we can. The professions. Well, a lot of times people go into professions, what? To make money, you know, to make money. And ethics, try to find a good ethics course at a university these days. They don't exist. They don't exist. And I mean, there's the big, even in our culture, the big thing, what happened this past week? The Supreme Court, okay, we're going to operate by this code of ethics, you know, which like anybody reading it would say, this is common sense. You shouldn't have to take the most brilliant legal minds in the country to come up with this. And then it was like, how is it going to be enforced? Oh, well, that's not our thing. We don't, you know, we didn't come up with how it's, you know. So, and so what's happened? Well, all these things.
Snobby.
Pardon me?
It's snobby on their part.
It is a little bit. But even education has capitulated to materialism, you know. I mean, the humanities are usually on the chopping block as soon as the funds disappear. What are the courses that disappear first? You know, humanities, sociology, all of the
Educational
liberal
curriculum
arts.
is driven by large corporations.
Yes, yeah. Well, and people going to school now, they're spending all this money for an education. What do they want out of that?
A job.
They want a job that's going to, A, help them pay back their school bills, but B, is going to set them up for a career that is lucrative in the future. And so this is why a lot of the educational system in our country is going for, you know, those kind of professions. You know, somebody wants a degree in sociology, the first question to parents is, well, what are you going to do with a sociology degree? What, are you going to open up a sociology store? What does that look like, you know? So it's like you got to get something that's going to be able, you know, an English professor. You know, that is not a desirable profession these days. It's hard to get a job as an English professor, partly because those departments are dwindling and the need for them. Humanities in general is hard to find a job in because even institutions are under the gun. So, I mean, all of these things are kind of driven by values that are different from the kingdom. And what we have to do as kingdom people is to find ways within these places when we are in these situations to press for and to live in those kingdom values. So what does that look like for these things? So part of what we need to do as people of the kingdom and maybe in our own church communities is have a serious conversation and regular conversation about how are we doing in these different areas and what contributions can we make in them for providing the leadership. Oftentimes I think the church has somewhat given up on these things because it's like, well, that's out of our, we're not in the public square anymore, so we don't have anything to say about education or government or, those kinds of things. But who has said that we're not in the public square? The world maybe has pushed the church or marginalized the church, but that doesn't mean that the church is necessarily marginalized unless we accept that. So, I mean, one of the things that government did way back in history, again, last century, but even before me, back in the FDR days, you heard about the New Deal. That was a big deal at that particular time. But what happened in the New Deal? What was the goal of the New? What was the objective in the big deal?
Social contract with people.
Consolidate power.
Some of that, but I mean, it was really to help people, right?
Safety net.
Safety nets, that kind of thing. Okay, so you had government agencies that began to find ways to put people to work, to give them a job, to give them a place to live, and so forth. Who had done that before the big deal? The church had done that, mostly. Mostly, you went to the church to find, help, assistance, place to live, those kinds of things. The church was a huge social network. But the church kind of became overwhelmed, particularly in some areas, with the need. They couldn't keep up with the needs. And because of the sense that it was like, well, it's us and we're not necessarily in partnership with any other church in our particular area, we just can't bear that burden anymore. The church willingly gave that role over to the government. They basically said, thank God, we don't have to do this anymore. But then what happened? The church began to lose its voice in the public square, and because it just ceded its authority over to the government and said, okay, here you go. What else has the church done in that regard? Do we pay taxes as a church for the property that we sit on? We don't pay taxes, but what is the consequence of that? We have no voice. Stay out of the government. So if a church wants to have that kind of public voice, one of the things it has to deal with is we may lose that benefit, It's okay. There are some churches who don't avail themselves of that. They tell their parishioners, just about anybody's contributions anymore are no longer necessary on your tax form, but it used to be, you could deduct your charitable contributions, but they will say your charitable contributions are not tax deductible because we don't live under that restriction, so we can speak our mind, or we can add our voice to the public conversation. So the church has had this kind of really odd arrangement with the government because we've not really understood how to work within that role in a way that makes sense, that helps others. We have in the past, but we've kind of lost that. It's been polarized. And so one of the things that I think we have to think through is how do we help these institutions exist for the welfare of the whole, to provide the common goods for the benefit of all. And so when we think of it that way, working in these professions is every bit as much of a sacred calling as anything else that we've identified as such. So those are, we've normally reserved that for people who are in full-time Christian service somehow. But when you look at it from a kingdom standpoint, all of this stuff is sacred. It's all sacred because it's all doing God's work. you know. And so we should have as much support and respect and value placed on those as anything else. And so I appreciate it when we give honor to teachers, and when we give honor to people who work in government, when we give honor to people in business or professions and so forth, because we're declaring that these things are just as important in the kingdom as anything else, and we should continue to do that. But we have to be strategic in the way we work in these places. And this is often where we fall down, because we're not very strategic. We tend to get in the way of that ourselves, because instead of speaking in terms that are accessible to everybody, you know, we tend to put up, you know, walls where there aren't any walls to begin with, you know. So instead of speaking a language that is accessible and says to them, we care about what's going on with you, and we're going to do our level best to do that, to help you get there, we stumble by saying, well, God wants this to happen. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you say that, what's happened? Well, you've basically shut out most of the world's understanding of that, because, you know, they don't want anything to do with it. That's religion, and we don't want that to be part of our thing. So we have to be strategic in the way we do these things.
I can't help thinking about Christian nationalism. It seems like the exact wrong way to go about trying to include your Christian worldview in government or education.
Interestingly enough, many of the people, I should say, not most, and I'm not an authority on that. That's not my area of expertise. But just from observation and from what I read from other Christian sources, that many of the people who are proponents of Christian nationalism are not part of any church at all. You know, they are part of a group that has left the church, but hasn't left the faith as they understand it. So, so they're, and then so that attracts other people, you know, to that, because there isn't an association with an institution per se. And so, but a lot of the people making waves in that are not. Now there are plenty of churches that are also, you know, heart and soul into that. But a lot of the people who are for Christian nationalism aren't members of any church at all, or aren't even ardent followers of Jesus per se. You know, they're in love with an idea, and some of that goes back to times past, eras past. Like when I was a kid, when a lot of us in here were kids, the kind of civil religion of the United States was Christianity, right? And it wasn't an official declaration, but it was kind of understood. It was kind of understood, and we still, you know, they still posted the Ten Commandments on the church doors, and you still have prayer in schools and things like that. And there was this whole civil understanding that we are based on Judeo-Christian values and foundations, you know, and that was what it meant to be an American, you know. And but we've kind of drifted, obviously, from that, and there is some good to that, because there were a lot of people who were American and figured they were Christian just because they were Americans. You know, that's not right. And so we've disabused them of that notion, but we haven't come in with anything else. So we're kind of like that guy that Jesus talks about in Matthew, where he says, you know, he had a demon cast out of him, and but nothing went in its place. So the demon roamed around and went, where am I going to land? And so he finally came back, found the place swept clean, and he said, okay, well, I'll just reoccupy here. And he brought 7 pals with him, and, you know, the end result was worse than the first. And we've kind of done that with our society in a sense, you know. We've swept it clean of, you know, this idea of the civil religion part of it, but we haven't replaced it with anything coherent, and so much has come in now to fill that void that is hard to, you know, to get this back. So we have to, and it's not going to be easy in any sense to do this. So I'm not suggesting that it is. I'm just saying that, but we have to begin somewhere, or at least continue. The church has done a good job in a lot of these areas. It's not as though we're absent, in these. But we don't always do the best job in them. And we have to pray for the ability to do what we do well and for the benefit of Christ and His kingdom. And I think that as we begin to think more intentionally about that, we can help direct people in kingdom ways and values back to these things are meant for the welfare and flourishing of all, and how can we do that in ways that make sense and help? And then when it becomes compelling, people will say, why do you do this? Why do you do that? And then you can say, do you really want to know? And then we have the opportunity to share with them the foundation for why we do these things the way we do them. And the problem is we tend to begin with that foundation and puts them up. If people understood that Jesus wasn't a religious figure when He was on earth, that one of the biggest tragedies about Jesus in our contemporary society is that He's become a religious figure. And so, because of that, anytime you bring them up, people dismiss it because, well, I'm not into that. I'm not into religion. But but people will talk about other great thinkers and follow them. So we have to put Jesus back in the great thinker category. If we truly think He was the most interesting, the most intelligent, the best of humanity, then we have to act on that and act accordingly. All right, I think we've got enough on that. Do you have any questions, any comments, who wants to run for government now? Who wants to run?
I have a quick